Look a little spacey. Look like I'm part of
We
a
are officially live. Amy, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad that we could have this lunch and learn today. I'm going to post our YouTube link on our website so then all of our guests can be here. By the way, if you are a guest watching this lunch and learn today and you're watching the recording of this, you can fast forward by about 4 minutes. We will get started in 4 minutes. If you're joining live, we started 5 minutes early just to allow everybody attending the live session to jump in live and participate. But Amy, thanks for being here.
I am so glad to be here, Garrett. Thank you.
Cool. I'm excited to talk about this topic. I think this is a really relevant topic for mentoring relationships because I feel like when we go into a mentoring relationship, it's so understandable for us to, have whatever everybody has biases. And I think you did a really good job of correcting me when I had first kind of brought up this idea of quote unquote minimizing unconscious bias, but you can't minimize it. Everybody's got bias. It's overcoming those biases, which I really appreciate you correcting me on. But yeah, I'm really excited to chat about that with you. So while we're waiting for a couple of minutes for everybody to jump into the YouTube channel, or just to the YouTube live stream, I love just to ask you just maybe introduce yourself, share a little bit about you, and I guess what I'd be curious is why did you start researching this in the first place? What got you invested and interested in studying unconscious bias?
Sure. So, thank you. First of all, so my name is Amy Waninger. I am the CEO of Lead at Any Level. And yes, a little bit about me. I'm going to explain that I am, home in quarantine right now with 3 kids, 2 of whom are probably going to play a game called Who Can Scream the Loudest. And that'll be happening in the background at some point during this conversation. I can almost guarantee it. So you can, I don't
It's
even charge extra for
understandable.
that.
It's understandable. We're working from home. We're in quarantine period.
Exactly. But how I got started on this it was interesting. When I was younger, I grew up in Southern Indiana. It was a very rural community, very white, very working class. And I didn't know a ton of people who had gone to college. When I went to college, I had no idea what I was supposed to do other than I was there to learn. And I decided at one point that I would major in all sorts of things. But basically what happened was I read about the ACLU somewhere and I thought, oh, what a cool organization. I want to do that. And I majored in criminal justice, African-American studies. I had a minor in sociology and Spanish. And then I found out how much law school was going to cost. And I found out what the phrase pro bono meant. And I decided that law school was not going to happen for me. So the ACLU was not a thing I could go do. So instead, I went back, I got a second degree in computer science. I spent 20 some years doing IT work, the last 12 of it in the insurance industry. And during that time, the company I was working for hired a chief diversity officer. They rolled out some unconscious bias training. I started doing some research and I thought, ooh, if I could do this work and get paid for it, that's what I want to do. And so I started reading everything I could. I volunteered everywhere I could, eventually wrote my own books on the topic, and here I am.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Amy, I really appreciate you sharing that story. I think that's really cool how you kind of it's funny how it seems like unconscious bias has followed you throughout your life. It's almost like you started interested in it and then you thought there was one path towards getting there and then you totally pivoted and iterated it in a different direction, but it kept bringing you back. And so I think that's really, really cool and that's really awesome. That's what you did, and I'm glad that you're doing it now, and I'm glad that you're here today. By the way, it is officially noon Eastern Standard Time on this wonderful Wednesday, April 29th of 2020. I'm excited to have you all here. If you are watching live, please introduce yourself in the comment section. Hey Pamela, thanks for being here. I can see you're under your son's login Sprite Gamer Boy Kid. My personal when I was a child was GHM Sports. So I can relate to the similar username. It was at AOL when AOL was a thing. Hey, Navneet, thanks for introducing yourself. But yeah, everybody introduce yourself who's here watching live. Hey, Laura, thanks for being here. So we have our awesome guest, Amy Waninger here. Amy gave a little intro of herself. I was just curious as to how she got into unconscious bias in the first place. Hey, Miranda. Hey, Lori. I was just curious as to how she got into unconscious bias and studying unconscious bias in the first place, because I think it's something that's very curious and it's something that's very palpable. And I think it's very relevant in this time and period in our society right now. And in a mentoring relationship, we could have our biases. We could come in not necessarily even realizing we have a bias because of somebody's age, race, gender, what they work on, what they do for their work. And I think that those hold us back from accomplishing the best possible mentoring relationships we can possibly achieve. And so when I learned about what Amy is working on, I said, man, this is going to be a perfect lunch and learn topic. Because I think that if we can overcome understand that we have unconscious bias. Everybody has unconscious bias. I have unconscious bias. Amy, you got unconscious bias. We all have biases. But if we can acknowledge them and then overcome them and work on overcoming them, we can build significantly better mentoring relationships. And yeah, I don't know. When I learned your story and a little bit about you, Amy, I thought this is a perfect lunch and learn topic. So to get started, hey, Lauren, thanks for being here. Hey, Jim. Um, Amy, what is unconscious bias? Could you just explain that to us?
Sure. I like to refer to unconscious bias as the decisions we make when we don't know we're making decisions. So the very nature of them is that they're unconscious. We're not aware of them. And bias just means preference. So a lot of people hear the term bias and their gut reaction is, but I'm not a bigot. And that's not what this is about. This is about the culmination of all of your experiences, of everything you've learned, everything you've been told, everything you've been taught, everything you've experienced interacting with other people from before you were even born, all the way up until today. And it's all about the shortcuts that our brains take to make sense of the world. We are not good at multitasking. So if you think about back before the sickness, when we could all commute to work, and you think about your commute, how many days did you arrive to work not remembering how you got there? Because you were just on autopilot, right? Your brain was somewhere else. It's not good at multitasking. And what we're good at, though, what our brains are really good at is sorting. And the two categories we sort into first are been there, done that, and that might kill me. And there's nothing in between. That's the first kind of binary sort you do. And that's because, physiologically speaking, like we had to have that decision-making capability to save us from the saber-toothed tigers, right? So this is something that we've evolved into. And our brains are still really, really good at sorting into been there, done that, and that might kill me. And most of the new experiences you have are going to fall in one of those two categories.
Oh, that's interesting. So one, I love the analogy to caveman days. I feel like there's so much of our human physiology and our biology that is so predicated on Homo sapien days. I don't know. I personally have this curiosity. You ever wonder, like, how do certain animals where maybe they don't even have like a full brain or barely, produce brain, how do they just know to procreate? How do they know to keep expanding their species? I I don't, and I feel like I've become gradually more consciously aware that there are probably some instincts that I have in me that I don't even consciously realize that I have, or the things that I do and the way I do them that are instinctual. And so maybe there's some other being that exists that's looking at us as humans and being like, how do they know to keep doing these things? I don't know. Maybe that's a meta thought,
Yeah.
but I think it's fascinating how it pertains to unconscious bias. I think that's really interesting. And so what you're saying is that people have these inherent instinctual thoughts about other people or about other things, been there, done that. And they come into a meeting, a conversation, a relationship, maybe a mentoring relationship, and they think to him or herself, I know who this person is based on my prior experiences with people who I think are like that. Is that correct?
That's absolutely part of it, but I'll go even a level uh, more abstract than that. You see someone, and here's the kind of the least threatening example of this I can think of. You walk into a meeting and you see someone who in some way looks like somebody who dumped you in high school. All right, someone you dated in high school, right? Dumped you. And before you even consciously realize what's happening, you get a certain feeling in your gut, right? You feel shame or embarrassment or anger or sadness, right? And you don't even know why. You haven't even put it together in the rational thinking part of your brain yet. But something about this person triggered a feeling. And what happens next is your brain starts to tell you a story to explain the feeling. So if you see somebody who makes you feel uneasy, you'll start telling yourself there's something about this, something wrong with this person. I can't trust them. That's why I'm feeling this way.
Interesting.
So without even consciously realizing what you're doing, and if you think about it, like if you're driving down a highway late at night, right? Total darkness, and all of a sudden you look up, no cars around, all of a sudden you look up and there's you see red and blue lights flashing in your rearview mirror, right? What's the first thing that happens? Your heart starts racing and you take your foot off the gas, right?
Yeah, freak out.
And
Yeah,
then
absolutely.
in your brain, you're thinking, why am I being pulled over? Maybe my tail lights out. Maybe I was speeding. Maybe I was doing this. Maybe, the cop doesn't like people who look like me. Whatever the thing is, right? You get yourself all worked up. Heart keeps racing. Heart keeps racing. Cop goes around you off to like a real emergency, right? You're not the problem at this point, right? You're not even, what he was worried about. How long does it take you to regulate your breathing, your heart rate, your radio, your foot on the gas back to normal? Because now you have to tell yourself a new story that you're not a target anymore. So our thinking is always catching up with our feeling. And that's what we need to be careful of with unconscious bias.
Interesting. So why do we need to be careful of that with unconscious bias? I guess, how
Well,
does that manifest itself?
Because we prejudge people. So we walk in and we say, okay, well, this person, right? Our brain does this for us instantly, right? Our guard's up, we have a flight response, or we don't. We either walk in and we instantly trust or we instantly distrust. And usually that has very little to do with the other person and a lot more to do with us. Now you think about all of the experiences and all of the relationships that you miss out on, all of the people that you don't get the best from, because for some reason, in a microsecond, when you walked in and met them for the first time, you put your guard up. Now, one of the examples that I use for this is I used to work with somebody who was shorter than I am, and I'm 5'3". Almost no adult is shorter than I am. Okay. Not very many. But I had this woman on my team and she was shorter than me. And I noticed that I was uncomfortable talking to her if we were both standing. And I couldn't figure out why. And then I realized it's because I had to tilt my head to look down at her, and she had to tilt her head to look up at me. And it made me uncomfortable that she had to tilt her head to look up at me, and that I had to tilt my head to look down at her because she was about 6 inches shorter than I was. Now, this was not a problem between the two of us. This was a problem between my left ear and my right ear, right? But if I had not thought about why am I uncomfortable, and the reason I was uncomfortable, by the way, was that I was her manager and I didn't want her to feel like I thought I was above her just because I was her manager. So you think about the layers and layers and layers deep this goes and how ridiculous it is, right? This is one example and a pretty superficial one. But if I hadn't gone back and kind of untangled that thread to figure out what was going on, I might have held her at arm's length. Right? I might not have brought her into my trust circle. I wouldn't have gotten all of the benefit of that relationship that I was able to get because I kind of untangled my own bias. Now, that's one example, but how many times have we done that? Maybe it's not the person's height, right? Maybe they have a lisp or an accent or a lazy eye, or they're a different color from us, or they come from a different place, or they wear different clothes, or they eat foods that don't smell like we expect foods to smell. There are all these reasons why we disengage from people because we're uncomfortable and we're missing out.
That's so fascinating. That makes a lot of sense. I'd be curious. Well, one, I think you're very self-aware. I think you have to be. I guess, how can we overcome that? How can we, one, recognize that it exists? I feel like for me, I'm inherently defensive, and maybe I would assume maybe other people are similar to me. Where, and by the way, my partner Dee, she points this out about me all the time. Where if I have a thought or a feeling about somebody else, and she is saying like, "Hey, why do you have this bias? Why do you have this thought about this other person?" And inherently I get defensive because I can't explain it. How do you go about recognizing it in you? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So, and I think we were talking earlier, you can't undo your biases. This is part of who we are, This is just how you're wired. It's just like you can't undo your vascular system, right? Like it's just part of your body. But what we can do is we can be conscious. We can move from unconscious to conscious, and we can overcome this. And the way we do that is step one, put yourself on notice. So when you feel these feelings that you don't understand, instead of jumping to a story to explain them, ask yourself why you're feeling that way in the first place. Now, this is hard for people because a lot of people are not very in touch with their feelings, right? So if you feel a flutter in your chest, if you feel your heart racing, you feel a sinking feeling in your gut, you feel your ears go red, whatever the feeling is, right? Think about, why am I feeling that way? Now, if I go back to my example with my team member who was shorter than I was feeling discomfort, right? And when I untangled that discomfort, it wasn't just that I was uncomfortable in the moment, right? Physically uncomfortable with my head tilted down, looking at a grown-up person. But then I had to think about, why is that uncomfortable for me? Well, it's uncomfortable for me because I'm used to being short, right? That's kind of an identity for me, is that I'm shorter than most people. But it was also about my values. And the values that was bringing up were, I wanted to be an egalitarian manager, right? Which is an identity that I have, right? I wanted to be somebody who was a partner in the work. I wanted to be somebody who was respected, not for my title, but for my contribution. And I wanted my team members to feel the same way. So not only was it noticing how I was feeling, but it was also backing into, what are the values that are driving those feelings? And then what are the identities that those values are protecting? And when you get to that identity, and here's the key, most people, at the core of their identity is, I'm a good person. And so however they're feeling, it's protecting them from having to think, what if I'm not a good person? So one of the questions I ask people is, well, what does it mean to be a good person? Like, write down everything you think that means. And that's a topic for another day. But really, like, at the end of the day, like, we all have this notion of what it means to be a good person. And typically when we're feeling uncomfortable, it's because there's some violation of that identity or some segment of that identity. So that's step one.
So, and just to
Go
be
ahead.
clear, and then kind of going into your story, you didn't like the idea of looking down at this other woman because you perceived that that wasn't consistent with your identity, or with your identity of being an egalitarian leader, because you liked the idea of never looking down on somebody else. Is that correct?
Right. So there was this, it felt disrespectful to me to look down to see her, because it felt like, to me, I was treating her like a child,
Mm,
because the only people I typically have to tilt my head down to look at are children.
got it. That makes sense.
So it took a while to untangle that. So just putting yourself on notice, noticing how you're feeling and where is that coming from, is a huge step in the right direction. And most of the time you'll find the problem is all in your head, not with you. And it's not an interpersonal problem. It's an inner ear problem. Inter ear, not inner ear.
That's so funny. I feel like so often, I mean, I've heard this all the time from other professionals I've spoken with, where there'll be that person who they feel like is just out to sabotage them, and so often it's not them out to sabotage them, it's just within their head. And I think that you're making a lot of sense in terms of those biases that I may have about somebody else because of something else that happened in my life totally prior to me ever meeting that person. And yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, Amy.
Yeah,
So let's talk about mentoring. How can
sure.
an unconscious bias show up in a mentoring relationship?
Oh my goodness. Well, every time we interact with other people, every moment of every day, we are bringing all of our past to that moment, right? Every experience we've ever had, every interaction we've ever had with other people, all of the knowledge, all of the anxiety, everything that we've ever had, we're carrying with us all the time, right? And so when we show up with other people, now we're managing two sets of experiences, two sets of values, two sets of identities, two sets of expectations, two different communication styles, two different everything, right? And every place where we're different is an opportunity for conflict. every place where we prioritize differently. So if you and I have the same, let's say we had the same values, if you and I sat down and made a list of our top 5 values, and we went away for a week-long retreat, and this was all we could think about was, what are your top 5 values? And we came out with like the absolute truth of what our top 5 values are. And your first one was safety of other people, and your second one was respect for other people. And my first was respect first and safety second. And our other 3 matched up perfectly. We can already tell how we could get into conflict, right? Because
Yeah.
if my first priority is respect and then safety, and yours is safety first and then respect, and you yell at me to keep me from doing something that's not safe, you violated my number 1 priority, which is respect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Do you mind elaborating on that just a little bit?
Sure. So all of our values are just about priorities, right? Everybody has values, and everybody prioritizes their values a little bit differently. So whatever you put at the top may not be somebody else's number 1. And so what you're acting on, I'm a good person, so I'm going to keep you safe, for example. I'm thinking I'm a good person and I don't yell at people. So now I've made a judgment about you, which is you're not respectful and therefore not a good person. And you've made a judgment about me, which is I wasn't being safe and therefore not a good person.
Interesting.
So, but what I'm trying to get to is we have thousands of these. A lot of them we don't even realize are happening. And everybody else has thousands of these that they can't articulate properly either. And we're constantly stepping on each other's priorities of values. Now, the more different we are, right? If I grew up in a completely different culture or subculture, right? You think about the difference between the Southern United States and the Northeast, for example, right? It's really easy to see how things are prioritized differently. People in the Northeast are always in a hurry. That's rude to people in the South. People in the South want to take their time and get to know you. That's wasting people's time if you're in the Northeast, right? So every little way that we're different is an opportunity for these kinds of conflicts to arise. So when you're in a mentoring relationship, and particularly a peer mentoring relationship, you need to realize that you're coming at this moment with a completely different set of experiences, values, judgments, identities than the other person. And the more questions we ask about why is that so important to you? Thank you for pointing that out. Can you tell me more? The more we can do that in our interpersonal relationships, the better connected we're going to be, the more we're going to understand where the other person's coming from and how they're prioritizing, their ever-changing list of values and needs, so that we can relate better and connect more deeply.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great question. So that's, a golden question to highlight in there. Why do you feel that way? But I think what's really critical is how you ask that question, because I think it can be very different if you say, well, why do you feel that way versus why do you feel that way? I think how you ask
Yeah.
it can be so critical to the way you get somebody to respond, because if you ask it like the previous way that I'd asked it, which was really, really aggressive, I would imagine that it would incite defensiveness on the other person and be unlikely to get an honest, authentic response. What do you agree? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, what I noticed was when you said that, when you said, why do you feel that way? You leaned forward, right? You were
Yeah,
getting
I
in an
did.
imaginary person's space in that moment, right? You were being aggressive. But when you said, why do you feel that way? You were backing up, you were opening your body language, you were being inquisitive and letting people in and being vulnerable. And so if you find yourself physically, again, this is a bias, right?
That's literally back to the whole caveman, Homo
Tell
sapiens.
right.
Like, yeah, like
Show
back to
right,
our
make yourself
instinctual.
big so the bear won't attack, right? Like that's what you
Yeah,
were doing in that first question. Make yourself big so the bear won't attack, rather than putting your hands to your sides and leaving yourself vulnerable to attack by inviting someone in with a question. And if you notice yourself asking a question in a defensive way, you will find a lot of times you're leaned forward, your hands are in front of you, you're blocking your torso so that you can prevent, this person from like diving at you and like, biting out your you know, your Adam's apple or whatever the thing is that we used to do when we were cavemen. I don't know. But, but just being vulnerable and putting yourself in that space completely changes how you ask the question.
That is so interesting. And it's so true. I literally was leaning forward and I was leaning backwards when I had said it the second way. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a great mentorship tip and note is when you're asking questions to your mentor, even if you're on a video call, like a Zoom call, like we're on right now, because we're all social distancing right now, you can be defensive or you can be vulnerable. You want to lean towards being vulnerable. You don't want to ask questions defensively. You don't want to lean forward in your chair and be aggressive or be the aggressor on the questions, because your likelihood of building a vulnerable, trusting, deep relationship is much lower. So I think that's a great insight there, Amy. I'd love to ask the next question of how should one address this in a mentoring relationship? So let's say I'm in a mentoring relationship. I believe someone has a bias against me, towards me. How can I effectively communicate that to them? I don't want to offend them, but I want to make it very clear that this is how I feel. What do you think? How do you respond to that?
Yeah. So let's start with a quick discussion of power dynamics. And I know this will make a lot of people uncomfortable, but I think it's important to address. And I want to say that if you walk into any conversation one-on-one and you're not aware of what power dynamics are at play, that means you are in the position of power.
That makes so much sense.
Because every single one of us knows when we walk into a room with somebody who has the power over us, whether it's over our pay, our personal safety, our promotion, our higher ability, right? We know what that feels like to walk into that room and know that that person has power over us. So if you're not thinking about a power dynamic in a conversation, it's because you're the one with the power.
Wow. That is so fascinating and so true, because you're comfortable. If you're not thinking about, like, if there's no thought to, okay, here's where I need to make sure that the talking points that I bring up or the conversation points that I bring up, this is where I almost feel like I need to be maybe guarded or maybe not necessarily be totally vulnerable. If you don't feel that way, if you're feeling totally comfortable, like you've got nothing to lose, yeah, you are the person in power. That's a great insight. So with that said, how can we go about acknowledging it and helping someone who feels the power dynamic because they are not the person in power? How can they go about feeling more comfortable being vulnerable?
Absolutely. And so just in what you said, right, people don't want to offend someone or hurt their feelings or put them off. If you're worried about that, it's because the other person has more power, right? And I'm going to be very vulnerable and I'm going to say to you that as a woman, I know how most men are treating me almost instantly, whether I can trust them or not.
Interesting.
Because most men have, at the very least, influence over my personal safety if I'm in a one-on-one situation with them, right? This is how I've been brought up to do that calculus to figure out this man is safe, this man is not safe, right? That's just the way of the world for women. That's how we grow up.
Yeah.
Now, that's one aspect. But I also know that if I'm in a room with a Black woman, she's looking at me thinking, I don't know if I can trust her. And I've got to be careful what I say, because if I say the wrong thing and she gets offended, there goes my reputation. And so we're always looking out for how do we, and again, if you're not doing that calculus, it's because you don't have to, which means you have more social power. So anytime you're not doing that, anytime you're not worried about offending someone, you need to be prepared for them to give you the feedback that you may not be treating them with respect in the way they want to be treated with respect.
Yeah.
Because again, the way our values line up, respect looks different for different people.
That's so interesting, because I mean, I'll be transparent, I'll be honest, I can say this. Thinking about what you just said and thinking about that whole situation, I don't, as a white male, I guess I don't even think about it. I guess I've not even been consciously aware up to this point. But yeah, am typically not as concerned about offending people because I assume I'm not offending somebody.
Right. You assume you're not because the repercussions for doing so are minor.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's
Right?
yeah.
If you offend me, you can write that off as she was being too sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were Black and you offended me, you could write that off as she's angry.
Yeah.
But if I offend you, my life could be in danger, not because you personally are dangerous, but because my entire life I've been watching cop shows about women who are dead because they offended a man. Right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And so this is the societal thing. Now people say, "Oh, well, we can leave all of that at home when we come to work." No, we can't. That's all buried in us. And every experience that we've had, everything that we've been taught, from the time I was born and I got a pink blanket at the hospital and was treated as more delicate and more fragile and less smart and less capable and less self-sufficient. Whereas you got a blue blanket at the hospital and you were, from the day you were born, what a big boy, what a strong young man, right?
Yeah.
The
Some conditioning.
messages that we have received our whole lives have been different. And I can't leave that at home when I walk into work every day, and neither can you.
That makes a lot of sense. So how can we call out bias? How can we go about calling out bias? How can we be more consciously aware of our own privilege and the biases we may have about other people? How can we go about overcoming these biases? How can we go about making our work environments a stronger place to work at? How can we go about making our mentoring relationships better mentoring relationships for those that we're in?
Tell your stories and ask other people for theirs. The more, so amazing thing happens. And I want to just real quick, I know almost time, but even people who don't have working vision, so there's some sever between their optic nerve and their brain, have mirror neurons, and they will actually mimic the facial expressions of the people that they're looking at, even though they can't, in their brains, they can't see what those people are how those people are looking at them. When we tell stories, it activates the empathy in other people. And when they tell us their story, it activates our empathy. The more empathy we can build between two people, the stronger we can connect across more difference. And so if I were to tell you about an experience I had where maybe I was in a working relationship, in a mentoring relationship with someone I trusted and they violated that trust, that would probably help you see our interactions a little bit differently. And you would probably be more empathetic and more sympathetic when approaching me, or if you were going to tell me something that might hurt my feelings because I had explained to you what that was like for me before. And the more we can share those stories up front, the faster we can build trusting relationships.
That's awesome. I love it. That's incredible. Amy, this has been really eye-opening, really insightful stuff. If anybody has any questions, please post them in the comment sections. We do have about a minute to answer any questions. Please post them there. But in the meantime, Amy, I'd love to ask you this one final question. How can our audience find you? If our audience is interested in connecting with you for anything, how can they find you? How can they connect with you?
Absolutely. So I offer right now virtual keynotes, but in the real world, I offer regular keynotes. I offer training and consulting services as well as coaching services to individuals and organizations to build inclusive cultures and to build diverse leadership bench strength. I think that's so important. And if you want to reach me, you can do so at lead@anylevel.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn as Amy C. Waninger. And that's a little tougher to spell. So if you just search for Lead at Any Level, you will find me.
That's awesome. And I'll be sure to post your LinkedIn and your website in the descriptions. I know the description's a little bit off right now. I'll edit it sometime later today. But everybody, thank you all for being here. This has been a wonderful lunch and learn. I feel like we've covered a lot of information. Amy, thank you for being here. And everybody who was here, thank you all for being here. Thanks for commenting in the comments section. This has been excellent. I'm excited for you all to continue your mentoring relationships into May. Hopefully we'll have some social distancing, procedures relieved, and you can hopefully begin meeting with your mentors one-on-one, face-to-face, if that's possible. But video chat is always a great way to connect with your mentor. Thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And I look forward to look forward to seeing you next month for our next Lunch and Learn. Have a good night, everybody.